Wind moves first across empty land. Not armies, not kings. Wind strips soil from bone, carries smoke from burned villages, erases yesterday's borders without asking permission. In places like this, permanence is a fantasy, and memory is a liability. Empires collapse here not with ceremony, but with scavengers already circling. The paradox is simple and cruel. The most durable powers are not born from order, but from collapse. They do not inherit systems. They inherit wreckage. They learn early that survival is not about justice or vision, but about reading decay faster than rivals. Where law evaporates, predators thrive. And when predators survive long enough, history politely renames them founders. This is not the story of a civilization rising. It is the story of a vacuum, learning how to bite back. History does not reward virtue here. It rewards those who mistake chaos for opportunity and never apologize for it. The land that would give birth to the Ottoman Empire was not a cradle. It was a landfill. Late 13th century Anatolia was a geography of exhaustion, a place where empires went to be half-remembered and poorly governed. The Seljuk Sultanate, once the regional manager of order, had been shattered by Mongol pressure and internal rot. What replaced it was not a successor, but a mess. Authority fractured into dozens of small Turkic principalities, each clinging to scraps of legitimacy, each claiming divine sanction, none strong enough to enforce it for long. To the east, Mongol overlords collected tribute without bothering to govern. To the west, the Byzantine Empire still existed on parchment and prayer, a hollowed structure with marble memories and unpaid soldiers, barely controlling its own capital and a few shrinking corridors of land. This was not a world that rewarded administrators or philosophers. It rewarded men who moved quickly, struck cheaply, and never waited for permission. Borders were theoretical. Loyalties were conditional. Violence was the only stable currency. In this environment, morality narrowed to logistics. Who could feed fighters? Who could promise loot? Who could cloak plunder in meaning? Religion provided the marketing. The frontier between Islam and Christendom was not a line, but a fog. And within that fog emerged the Ghazi, the holy warrior, a figure both spiritual and opportunistic. The Ghazi was not necessarily devout. He was effective. Raiding the lands of unbelievers came prepackaged with theological approval and practical benefits. You could burn a village and still feel righteous about it. You could steal land and call it destiny. For the countless dispossessed warriors, mystics, and nomads drifting through Anatolia, this was not ideology. It was employment. Into this ecosystem stepped a man who did not stand out at first glance. Osman was not the strongest. He did not command the largest following. He did not control the richest land. What he had was placement. His small domain sat pressed directly against the decomposing edge of Byzantine territory, where imperial authority was weakest and excuses for retaliation were plentiful. It was the perfect hunting ground. Every raid could be framed as defense, every expansion as obligation. Geography did the persuasion. Osman simply listened. He avoided the grand confrontations that killed ambitious men early. No heroic charges. No decisive battles that made rivals nervous. Instead, he practiced patience, a quality that frontier violence rarely rewarded, but chaos sometimes allowed. He isolated fortresses. He strangled supply lines. He waited. Byzantine garrisons, underpaid and unsupported, did the rest. When walls fell, it was often from neglect as much as assault. And when land changed hands, it did so quietly, without declarations that might provoke coalition resistance. Expansion masqueraded as drift. Around him gathered men who understood this rhythm instinctively. Warriors loyal not to institutions, but to momentum. As long as victories continued, allegiance held. Osman did not need to invent legitimacy yet. Success generated its own gravity. Stories followed, and later stories hardened into prophecy. Legend would eventually gift him a dream, a moon entering his chest, a tree growing from his body, rivers feeding its roots, the world shaded beneath its branches. Whether he dreamt it or not is irrelevant. What matters is that the story arrived after success, not before. Prophecy is always clearest in hindsight. It explains what already happened and pretends it was inevitable. In unstable environments, inevitability is a powerful narcotic. It convinces followers that survival was never luck, only destiny delayed. By the time Osman's raiding network began to resemble a state, the borderland itself had trained it well. There was no nostalgia for lost empires here, no bureaucratic sentimentality. The Seljuks were gone. Byzantium was bleeding. Mongols collected taxes and left scars. The Ottomans learned early that history was not a moral arc, it was a food chain, and those who mistook titles for power were eaten first. This environment also imposed a crucial discipline. Nothing could be wasted. Manpower was precious. Loyalty had to be engineered, not assumed. Pragmatism replaced purity. When useful, Christians were absorbed. When convenient, Byzantine administrative habits were copied. There was no cultural insecurity yet. Borrowing was not betrayal. It was efficiency. Identity remained flexible because survival demanded it. What emerged was not a nation or an empire, but a behavior pattern. Expand when neighbors are weakest. Retreat when attention grows. Legitimize violence with faith. Stabilize gains with structure only after they are secure. Above all, never confuse righteousness with restraint. The borderland punished restraint. It rewarded appetite. This is the true origin of Ottoman power. Not a divine mandate, not superior morality, not even exceptional leadership. It was adaptation without shame. A dynasty shaped by collapse learned to treat instability as a renewable resource. Long before it ruled cities, it mastered ruins. Long before it claimed law, it perfected opportunism. And long before it spoke of eternity, it learned the only frontier rule that mattered. In a world where everything is dying, the ones who survive longest are those who learn how to feed on decay without flinching. The dream comes after the knife work is already done. It always does. Prophecy rarely visits the uncertain. It prefers men who have proven useful to chaos. By the time the story of the moon and the tree attaches itself to Osman, he is no longer an anonymous chieftain clinging to survival. He is something more dangerous. He is consistent. In a frontier world addicted to improvisation, consistency reads as destiny. Men begin to confuse repetition with divine favor. Victories stack, rivals disappear, and suddenly violence feels less like a choice and more like a natural law working through a single body. Osman does not build a kingdom by announcing one. He builds inevitability. Each small success narrows the future options of everyone around him. Byzantine commanders, already starved of pay and hope, learn that resistance only delays the outcome. Neighboring beyliks watch carefully, calculating when opposing him will cost more than joining him. Osman never rushes their decision. He lets geography do the arguing. His territory sits like a pressure point against a decaying empire. Push gently, repeatedly, and the structure collapses on its own. This is where the dream becomes useful, not because it predicts the future, but because it simplifies it. A complex web of raids, alliances, betrayals, and quiet land seizures is compressed into a single image, a tree growing from one man's body, shading the world. It flatters followers and terrifies enemies. More importantly, it absolves violence. If growth is natural, then expansion is not aggression. It is biology. Who blames a tree for spreading its branches? Osman understands something that many conquerors learn too late. Killing men is easy. Convincing survivors to accept the killing is harder. He does not rule through terror alone. Terror is expensive. It demands constant replenishment. Instead, he pairs fear with predictability. Villages that submit keep their leaders. Taxes are collected, not improvised. Conversion is encouraged, not always forced. The message is clear and quietly seductive. Life under Osman may not be just, but it will be legible. In a collapsing world, legibility feels like mercy. His violence therefore becomes selective, almost bureaucratic. Fortresses that resist are starved, isolated, dismantled piece by piece. Those that surrender are absorbed. There is no theatrical cruelty, no grand massacres that would provoke united retaliation. Osman is not interested in headlines. He is interested in margins. He expands not in bursts, but in a steady crawl that feels less like conquest and more like erosion. Byzantine land does not fall, it dissolves. Faith provides the moral lubricant. The Ghazi ideal reframes material ambition as sacred duty. Warriors are not stealing cattle or land, they are fulfilling obligation. This matters deeply to men who have spent their lives drifting between loyalties. Osman offers them something rare, a reason to believe their violence counts for something beyond survival. He does not ask for purity, he asks for participation. As long as they ride under his banner, their sins arrive pre-absolved. Yet for all the later mythology, Osman remains remarkably unromantic about power. He does not crown himself emperor. He does not attempt to recreate Seljuk ceremony or Byzantine pomp. That would attract attention he cannot yet afford. He remains small on purpose. Titles are cheap. Territory is not. His authority grows horizontally before it grows vertically. Loyalty first spreads across land, then sinks downward into structure. This restraint is mistaken by later generations for humility. It is not. It is camouflage. What truly distinguishes Osman is not ambition, but timing. Many frontier lords share his hunger. Few share his patience. He understands that the Byzantine Empire is not dying quickly. It is dying badly. Civil wars, dynastic intrigue, economic exhaustion. These are slow killers. Osman aligns his expansion with this tempo. He advances when Byzantine factions are fighting each other. He pauses when attention shifts outward. He waits out emperors. Time becomes his most reliable ally. This patience gives rise to another critical habit. Osman rewards loyalty more than lineage. Blood matters less than usefulness. Men who prove competent rise quickly, regardless of origin. This flexibility allows his following to grow beyond tribal limits. His band stops being a clan and becomes a coalition, a dangerous transition. Clans fracture easily. Coalitions endure as long as incentives remain clear. Osman keeps them clear. Land, spoils, status, all conditional, all revocable. Authority remains personal, not institutional, but it is disciplined. The inevitability begins to harden. By the time Osman captures key fortresses and secures stable routes, opposition becomes irrational. To resist him is to bet on the revival of Byzantine authority. That bet fails repeatedly. Each failure reinforces the sense that Osman's rise is not merely successful, but correct. History, always eager to pretend it understands itself, starts whispering the word destiny. Osman does not live long enough to see an empire. That is important. Founders rarely do. They exist to normalize brutality, not to enjoy its architecture. His greatest achievement is not territory, it is precedent. He establishes the principle that expansion is the default state of his polity. Peace becomes temporary. Stagnation becomes decay. Violence is no longer an emergency measure. It is the engine. And once an engine is accepted as necessary, questioning it feels like treason. The dream, whether fabricated or remembered, seals this logic. It transforms contingency into commandment. If the world is destined to fall under the tree's shade, then resistance is not just futile. It is unnatural. Enemies become obstacles to growth, not moral equals. This framing will echo for centuries, long after the borderlands are gone and the empire has marble floors and legal codes. Violence will always feel pre-authorized because it was there at the beginning, wrapped in prophecy and patience. Osman leaves behind no manifesto, no legal system, no imperial blueprint. What he leaves is more potent, a behavioral script. Expand quietly, legitimize afterward, use faith to soften theft, use patience to outlast stronger rivals. Above all, never mistake survival for accident. Call it destiny early, and others will do the believing for you. This is how violence becomes inevitable, not through bloodlust, but through repetition, not through madness, but through method. Osman does not create an empire. He creates a habit, and habits, once entrenched, do not ask whether they should continue. They only ask where to move next. A tent can move. A throne cannot. That is the problem. Conquest is portable. Governance is heavy. It demands walls, ledgers, schedules, and men who wake up every day to do boring things correctly. Many conquerors reach this point and stall, staring at their own success like hunters unsure what to do with a carcass too large to drag home. Orhan does not hesitate. He understands immediately that momentum without structure is just noise. If his father taught the world how to fall apart profitably, Orhan must now teach it how to stay fallen under new management. The capture of Bursa is the moment where improvisation ends. A city does not tolerate ambiguity. It demands decisions. Taxes must be assessed. Justice must appear consistent. Grain must arrive on time. Raiders who once lived off movement now have to coexist with merchants who live off predictability. This is where most frontier dynasties implode, devoured by their own followers who were excellent at destruction and useless at restraint. Orhan solves this by changing the rules of reward. Loot becomes secondary. Stability becomes the real currency. He does not pretend to reinvent governance. That would be wasteful. Instead, he scavenges systems the way his father scavenged land. Seljuk bureaucratic habits, Persian administrative logic, Byzantine tax routines. He borrows shamelessly. Nothing is sacred except functionality. Ideological purity is a luxury of secure states. Orhan is still building one. His genius lies not in originality, but in selection. He keeps what works and discards what resists control. The first major innovation is delegation. Orhan understands that personal rule does not scale. Charisma has a ceiling, so he creates offices that outlive individuals. The divan formalizes decision-making. The Grand Vizier emerges not as a ceremonial figure, but as a pressure valve, absorbing blame, distributing authority, and keeping the Sultan distant from daily friction. This distance is crucial. Power must feel elevated even when it is administrative. Familiarity erodes fear faster than rebellion. Coinage follows. Minting silver is not just an economic act. It is a psychological one. It tells merchants whose authority matters. It tells soldiers who pays them. It tells neighbors that this polity expects to last long enough to care about denominations. Money standardizes loyalty. You can argue with sermons. You rarely argue with payroll. Education enters quietly. Madrasas appear not merely to train scholars, but to domesticate law. Religious interpretation becomes institutional rather than personal. This reduces the risk of charismatic clerics challenging the state with inconvenient theology. Faith is still central, but it is now curated. Orhan does not weaken religion. He nationalizes it. The transformation of the military is even more telling. The Ghazi warriors who built the early expansion are unreliable tenants. Their loyalty flows toward opportunity, not authority. They are brilliant in motion and corrosive in peace. Orhan keeps them useful, but begins to sideline them strategically. Regular pay replaces sporadic plunder. Units become salaried. Discipline becomes expected rather than negotiated. The state begins to own violence instead of renting it. This shift creates tension. Frontier fighters sense the change instinctively. A war band becomes a bureaucracy faster than its members would like. Orhan manages this with gradualism. He does not purge the old elite. He dilutes it. New forces appear alongside the old, quietly outperforming them in sieges and sustained campaigns. Results speak. Prestige follows efficiency. The city of Iznik becomes another testing ground. Once a Byzantine stronghold, it now hosts the institutions of an emerging state: law schools, courts, administrators. Orhan is turning conquered space into productive infrastructure. This is not glamorous. It is deadly in the long term. Empires do not endure because they conquer cities. They endure because cities begin to depend on them. There is a subtler transformation underway as well. Identity begins to shift. Under Osman, affiliation was personal. You followed the man. Under Orhan, allegiance starts to detach from individuals and attach to roles. You serve the Sultan, not because you know him, but because the system recognizes you. This transition is dangerous. It creates distance. It invites corruption, but it is unavoidable. A state that depends on personal loyalty dies with its founder. Orhan accepts this cost. He is less concerned with affection than with continuity. His reign is quieter than his father's, less dramatic, more consequential. Borders still expand, but without spectacle. What grows faster is the internal skeleton. Rules multiply, records thicken, precedent accumulates. The Ottomans begin to resemble something that can survive incompetence. That is the true test of statehood. The tent is not abandoned immediately. Symbolism lags behind reality. But the logic has changed. Decisions now assume permanence. Land is administered, not merely occupied. Populations are categorized. Obligations are tracked. The state starts to remember things, which is always the first step toward controlling them. This is also where the future dangers are quietly seated. Centralization creates choke points. Salaried armies demand constant revenue. Bureaucracy attracts those who enjoy power without risk. Every solution carries a delayed invoice. Orhan pays none of them yet. He is still in the honeymoon phase of administration, when efficiency feels like virtue and expansion covers mistakes. What matters is that by the end of his reign, the Ottomans are no longer a fortunate anomaly on a collapsing frontier. They are an organism with organs. Remove one part, and the rest continues. Kill a leader, and the system breathes on. This is the moment when conquest stops being reversible. From tent to throne is not a story of luxury replacing hardship. It is a story of violence learning how to sit still. Orhan domesticates aggression without extinguishing it. He cages it inside offices, pays scales and procedures. The blade remains sharp, but it is now stored properly. History will later celebrate conquerors. It rarely pauses for architects, but without this phase, everything that follows collapses into anecdote. Orhan does not dazzle. He stabilizes. And in doing so, he ensures that the habits his father created no longer belong to a man, but to a machine. The most reliable men in the empire are the ones who have nothing to lose. Families complicate loyalty. Land creates options. Memory breeds nostalgia. The perfect servant remembers none of these things. He wakes where he is told, eats what he is given, and believes that survival itself is a privilege granted daily by a distant master. This is the paradox at the heart of Ottoman power. The dynasty that conquered through flexibility would stabilize itself through human rigidity. Freedom made warriors unpredictable. Slavery made them precise. The solution emerges not from mercy or cruelty, but from arithmetic. Orhan's reforms professionalized violence, but professionalism creates bargaining power. A soldier who can resign is already dangerous. A soldier who inherits status becomes political. Muradvas understands this with unsettling clarity. If the state is to monopolize violence, it must own the men who wield it completely. Not figuratively, literally. Thus begins the devshirme, a word that sounds administrative because it is. Periodic levies of Christian boys from the Balkans, selected for strength, intelligence, and adaptability, removed from their families, converted, renamed, rebuilt, their old identities erased like chalk from slate. They are not recruited. They are harvested. The state does not ask for loyalty. It manufactures it. This is not an act of blind brutality. It is calculated engineering. By severing family ties, the Ottomans eliminate competing loyalties. By converting the boys, they bind them spiritually. By educating them, they make them useful beyond the battlefield. And by branding them slaves of the Sultan, they remove the possibility of independence. A Janissary does not serve the state. He is the state, in uniform. The training is relentless. Discipline replaces instinct. Formation replaces bravado. Silence replaces war cries. While Europe still fields feudal levies whose courage fluctuates with personal stakes, the Ottomans field something new. Men who advance because stopping is not an option. Men whose survival depends on obedience rather than heroism. They do not fight for glory. They fight because that is the condition of existence. The irony is surgical. These slaves become the most privileged class in the empire. They receive regular pay, superior equipment, direct access to power. They are educated, literate, and increasingly indispensable. Their barracks are cleaner than noble homes. Their kitchens better stocked. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, the lowest legal status produces the highest functional authority. Murad does not stop with infantry. The devshirme feeds the administrative class as well. Talented boys are siphoned into palace schools, trained as scribes, judges, and eventually grand viziers. The highest offices of the empire are now staffed by men who owe their entire existence to the Sultan's mercy. No ancestral estates, no rival clans, no external base of support. Their careers begin and end at the ruler's pleasure. This is governance by hostage logic, and it works. For a time, it works brilliantly. The Janissaries become the sharpest instrument in the Ottoman arsenal. Siege warfare, sustained campaigns, coordinated assaults, tasks that frontier warriors found tedious or beneath them. The Ottomans now excel at them. Fortresses fall not because of passion, but because of persistence. Europe notices too late. Chroniclers marvel at the discipline. Ambassadors whisper about the silence. Enemies begin to understand that courage alone is insufficient against men who have been trained to die on schedule. The Janissaries do not break ranks. They do not retreat impulsively. They advance like a mechanism winding down. Yet embedded in this efficiency is a delayed catastrophe. Absolute loyalty is addictive. Once a ruler experiences it, he builds systems around it. The Janissaries become not just soldiers, but political stakeholders. Their privileges harden into expectations, their uniqueness into entitlement. Over generations, the devshirme loosens. Sons follow fathers. Barracks become neighborhoods. Slavery becomes metaphorical. The very qualities that made them ideal begin to erode. When a Janissary marries, he acquires interests. When he owns property, he gains leverage. When his position becomes hereditary, he gains permanence. Permanence breeds confidence. Confidence breeds negotiation. Negotiation is rebellion wearing manners. But in this phase, none of that is visible yet. The empire is still expanding. Victories drown out structural warnings. Murad and his successors see only results. Europe buckles. The Balkans open. Armies melt away before this strange new force. The Ottomans draw the obvious conclusion. The system is perfect, therefore it must be preserved. This belief shapes everything that follows. Innovation becomes unnecessary. Adaptation feels risky. When success is total, change looks like sabotage. The Janissaries are no longer merely an army. They are proof that the empire's logic is correct, proof that obedience engineered from childhood can outperform any other model of human organization. The cruelty of the system is masked by its success. Parents resist devshirme at first, then they bribe officials to take their sons. A Janissary career offers wealth and influence unimaginable in rural villages. The empire transforms trauma into opportunity. Even its victims begin to participate willingly. This is how exploitation stabilizes itself. It offers a ladder. What the Ottomans create here is not just a military core, it is a philosophy of control. Humans are raw material. Identity is adjustable. Loyalty is programmable. If properly managed, people can be made into components, replaceable, reliable, efficient. For centuries, this machine will dominate battlefields and intimidate courts. It will also fossilize. When the world changes, the Janissaries will refuse to. They will defend their privileges with the same discipline they once defended the Sultan. They will overthrow rulers who threaten reform. They will burn cities to preserve routines. The slaves who ruled empires will eventually strangle it. But that is not yet visible. For now, the system gleams. The Ottomans have solved a problem that has plagued rulers since the first crown was worn. How to ensure loyalty beyond death, beyond kinship, beyond conscience. The answer is chillingly simple. Remove everything else. The dynasty that began in a borderland of improvisation has built an army of certainty, men who do not ask why, men who do not hesitate, men whose obedience feels like nature itself. History will later debate the morality, but history always arrives after the results are counted. At this moment, the Ottomans stand undefeated, armed not just with steel, but with an idea that power is safest when wielded by those who own nothing, remember nothing, and belong to no one but you. Empires like to imagine that history knocks before entering. It does not. Sometimes it arrives as an inconvenience, sometimes as weather, sometimes as the ground simply giving up. Europe does not enter the Ottoman story because of grand strategy or prophetic design. It enters because walls crack, commanders hesitate, and someone nearby is alert enough to move first. Destiny, in practice, looks a lot like opportunism wearing good timing. In the middle of the 14th century, the Ottomans are still an Anatolian power with Balkan curiosity. They raid across the water, probe defenses, test responses. Nothing permanent, nothing that would provoke the kind of coalition that could crush them early. The Dardanelles remain a psychological boundary. Crossing into Europe is possible. Staying there is dangerous. To establish permanence would mean announcing ambition too loudly. The Ottomans wait. History rewards the patient again. Then the earth intervenes. In 1354, an earthquake tears through the Gallipoli Peninsula. Byzantine fortifications, already underfunded and poorly maintained, crumble. Garrison walls split. Towers sag. Chaos spreads faster than news. This is not a military defeat. It is an administrative one. No relief arrives. No rapid reconstruction follows. Constantinople is distracted, divided, exhausted. A disaster becomes an invitation. Suleiman Pasha, Orhan's son, does not call a council. He does not wait for instructions wrapped in ceremony. He moves. Troops cross the strait and occupy the ruined positions almost casually, as if squatting in an abandoned building. When Byzantine officials protest, the reply is elegant in its simplicity. God has given us this place. The logic is airtight because it is unfalsifiable. Earthquakes do not testify in court. This moment is often romanticized later as fate. It is not. It is a test of reflexes. The Ottomans pass. Byzantium fails. Europe enters the Ottoman future not with a clash of banners, but with a shrug. No declaration of war, no crusade, just a permanent Ottoman footprint where none had existed before. That footprint changes everything. Raids can be repelled. Settlements require eviction. Once Ottoman families, soldiers, and administrators establish themselves in Europe, removal becomes costly. Retaking land demands coordination, money, and political unity. Byzantium has none to spare. Balkan rulers watch carefully. Some resist, others calculate. Many conclude that accommodation is cheaper than defiance. The Ottomans behave like seasoned tenants. They fortify selectively. They negotiate when useful. They absorb local elites rather than replace them wholesale. Taxes are predictable. Religion is managed pragmatically. Conversion is encouraged but not universally enforced. This flexibility disarms potential coalitions. Europe does not unite against an invader. It fragments into local responses, each too small to matter. The Balkan frontier becomes a laboratory. Ottoman administrators test systems. Military commanders refine siege techniques. Janissaries operate in unfamiliar terrain and adapt quickly. Each success reinforces a dangerous idea. Europe is not special. It is simply another resource to be managed. This perception hardens rapidly. Victories over Balkan forces feel strangely easy. Castles fall. Armies dissolve. Noble levies flee when pay dries up. The Ottomans are not shocked by this. They have seen it before in Anatolia. Empires decay similarly everywhere. Only the costumes change, yet Europe carries symbolic weight. This is Christendom. This is Roman inheritance. This is the world that once defined civilization. Each step deeper westward amplifies Ottoman confidence and European anxiety in equal measure. Raids become campaigns. Campaigns become provinces. The language of temporary presence quietly disappears. The frontier also sharpens Ottoman identity. Fighting Christians consistently requires internal discipline. Religious rhetoric intensifies. The Sultan's role as defender of Islam gains clarity. Expansion acquires cosmic framing. Europe is no longer just land, it is proof. Proof that the Ottoman system works beyond its birthplace. Still, there is no rush toward capitals, no immediate march on Rome or Vienna. The Ottomans continue their preferred method. Incremental pressure, divide opponents, reward submission, punish resistance with precision. Fear spreads not from spectacle, but from reliability. The Ottomans always come back. And when they do, they remember who resisted. Europe slowly realizes the danger, but realization does not equal response. The Balkans are politically fractured. Feudal obligations are thin. Religious unity collapses under dynastic self-interest. Calls for crusade echo hollowly. No one wants to pay for another holy war. Meanwhile, the Ottomans pay their soldiers on time. This asymmetry is fatal. The Ottomans do not need to conquer Europe quickly. They only need to remain. Time will handle the rest. Borders soften, alliances shift. Local rulers hedge their bets. Ottoman authority seeps into legal codes, tax systems, and marriage networks. In some regions, resistance becomes irrational. The empire begins to feel less like an occupier and more like gravity. The accident at Gallipoli thus becomes irreversible. An earthquake creates a crack. Opportunism widens it. Bureaucracy stabilizes it. Within a generation, Europe is no longer a destination. It is a domain. The Ottomans did not storm the continent. They slipped into it and refused to leave. History will later frame this as the opening act of a grand civilizational struggle. Islam versus Christendom, East versus West. But on the ground, it is quieter and more humiliating. Europe loses not to superior faith or superior numbers, but to a state that reacts faster, organizes better, and treats catastrophe as inventory. From this point forward, the Ottoman story can no longer be told without Europe. Every campaign, every reform, every crisis will be shaped by that accidental crossing. The empire's confidence grows, its enemies multiply, its ambitions mature, and its future becomes entangled with lands it never set out to rule, but learned to exploit because the ground broke at the right moment and someone was ready to step across the crack. Europe enters the story not as a foe prepared for war, but as a door left unlocked. The Ottomans do what they have always done best. They notice, they move, and once inside, they arrange the furniture as if they always belonged there. Some cities survive because they are strong. Others survive because everyone else is tired. Constantinople survives for centuries by perfecting both illusions. Its walls are legendary, its name heavier than its garrison, its past louder than its present. By the 15th century, the city is less a capital than a mausoleum with a coastline, but mausoleums still offend the living. As long as it stands, it denies legitimacy to anyone ambitious enough to want the title of emperor. For the Ottomans, the city does not merely block expansion, it blocks meaning, and meaning, unlike land, cannot be bypassed forever. Mehmed II understands this instinctively. He is not a frontier predator like Osman, nor an administrator like Orhan. He is something colder. An editor. He intends to correct history by deleting a paragraph that refuses to end. Constantinople must die, not for strategic convenience, but for narrative control. As long as Rome's eastern ghost breathes, the Ottomans remain usurpers. Kill the city, and the inheritance becomes undeniable. Mehmed is young, educated, and dangerously focused. He reads Alexander and Caesar not as inspiration, but as benchmarks. He does not want to be great. He wants to be unavoidable. His first reign as a child taught him a crucial lesson. Power that hesitates is power that gets managed by others. When he returns to the throne, he does so without sentiment. An infant brother is quietly removed. Stability is declared. Mercy is postponed indefinitely. The city watches from across the water as Mehmed begins to tighten the vice. On the European shore of the Bosphorus, a fortress rises with unsettling speed. Rumeli Hisara is not subtle architecture. It is a threat built from stone. Together with its counterpart on the Asian side, it chokes the strait. Ships passing without permission are destroyed. Grain stops arriving. Aid becomes theoretical. The message is simple and cruel. You are already conquered. You just have not noticed yet. Mehmed studies the walls carefully. The Theodosian defenses have humiliated armies for 1,000 years. Swords and ladders are insults here. He requires a new grammar of violence. Gunpowder offers it. When a disgruntled Hungarian engineer arrives with sketches and ambition, Mehmed does not negotiate. He funds excess. Cannons are cast not to breach walls, but to mock them. Bronze monsters, longer than houses, flinging stone heavier than myth. This is not siegecraft. It is industrial theater. When the bombardment begins, the city discovers that history has changed without consulting it. Each shot lands like a verdict. The walls crack. Repair crews work at night, packing rubble and hope into gaps torn open by daylight. Civilians carry stones alongside soldiers. Faith becomes manual labor. Courage turns repetitive. Inside the city, The numbers are obscene. 7,000 defenders, 14 miles of walls. Outside, an army that breathes smoke and discipline. Mehmed's forces are not a mob. They are sequenced, engineers, artillery, infantry, Janissaries waiting in silence like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. The Golden Horn remains a problem. A chain blocks entry. The harbor is secure. Mehmed stares at it and does something unthinkable. If ships will not move through water, they will move through land. Overnight logs are greased. Roads are improvised. Men and oxen drag vessels over hills while the city sleeps, convinced that physics is still loyal to them. Morning arrives. The Ottomans float where they should not be. Morale collapses faster than masonry. The final assault is procedural. Waves of expendable troops exhaust defenders. Better trained units follow. And then when resistance trembles, the Janissaries advance. No shouting, no flourish, just synchronized inevitability. A commander falls wounded. A gate is left unsecured. Someone makes a mistake. Someone always does. The banner rises where it should not. The city understands, suddenly and collectively, that it is finished. The emperor dies as emperors do when stories end. Anonymous, surrounded, stripped of symbolism. His body disappears into the consequence of his century. The Roman Empire, which once claimed eternity, expires quietly in a crowd. The aftermath is not mercy. Loot is permitted. Slavery follows. Memory fractures. But Mehmed enters the city not as a barbarian, but as an owner. He dismounts. He touches the earth. He orders continuity. Churches become mosques. Streets fill again. Populations are invited back under new management. The city is not erased. It is repurposed. Constantinople becomes Istanbul, not through renaming alone, but through function. A dead capital is useless. Mehmed rebuilds deliberately. He imports people, not just architecture. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Turks. Diversity is policy. Commerce is restored. Courts operate. The city becomes imperial again, only this time without nostalgia. Hagia Sophia's dome shelters new prayers. The past is not denied. It is subordinated. Yet beneath the triumph lies a structural decision that will echo disastrously. To prevent succession chaos, Mehmed legalizes fratricide. The state is elevated above blood. Murder becomes administration. The logic is perfect. The cost is deferred. Stability today. Weakness tomorrow. Princes will grow up isolated, paranoid, inexperienced. But for now, the empire is unified. The invoice will arrive later. The city had to die because it refused to decay politely. It lingered too long, daring history to contradict it. Mehmed accepts the challenge. He does not merely conquer. He closes a chapter that no longer makes sense. The Ottomans are no longer a successor state. They are the state. Rome has been absorbed. The Middle Ages end not with enlightenment, but with a wall collapsing under artillery fire. From this moment forward, the Ottoman Empire is unavoidable. It controls the hinge between worlds. It owns the past and dictates the future. The conquest is total, not because a city falls, but because a story does. And once a story is replaced, resistance becomes footnotes. Perfection is the most dangerous phase of power. It convinces institutions that they have reached the correct shape and should now be preserved rather than questioned. Under Suleiman, the empire does not merely expand, it crystallizes. Borders harden, procedures stabilize, grandeur becomes routine. The machine hums so smoothly that no one notices how little it now tolerates deviation. This is the moment historians later romanticize as a golden age. It is also the moment when the future quietly stops being invited into the room. Suleiman inherits an empire already frighteningly effective. His father has delivered wealth, territory, and religious legitimacy. The Sultan is now caliph, guardian of holy cities, master of a war machine feared from the Adriatic to the Persian Gulf. Suleiman's task is not to invent power, but to curate it. He does this with obsessive care. Where Mehmed broke worlds open, Suleiman arranges them. His reign is less about surprise and more about symmetry. Externally, the empire performs dominance with confidence. Belgrade falls, Rhodes submits, Hungary collapses in an afternoon of mud and cannon fire. Vienna resists, but resistance itself becomes proof of Ottoman reach. Even failure feels like authority when you are failing at the gates of someone else's capital. In the east, Baghdad returns to imperial orbit. At sea, Ottoman fleets under hardened corsairs turn the Mediterranean into a hostile workspace for Christian shipping. The empire does not just win, it appears everywhere at once. Internally, Suleiman's real work begins. Law becomes his chosen instrument. The Ottoman state has always operated under overlapping legal traditions. Islamic law, customary practice, sultanic decree. Over generations, this produces confusion. Confusion breeds corruption. Corruption threatens predictability. Suleiman cannot tolerate unpredictability. So he consolidates, he codifies, he harmonizes. The Qanun is not revolutionary. It is exhaustive. It standardizes taxes, land tenure, criminal penalties, market regulation. It tells officials what they may take and what they must not. It tells subjects what to expect and what to fear. This legal clarity is intoxicating. Justice becomes legible. Administration becomes efficient. The state feels fairer without becoming kind. Suleiman earns his second name not by mercy, but by consistency. Subjects may dislike the law, but they can calculate it. That alone reduces rebellion. Predictable oppression is easier to live under than arbitrary violence. Architecture mirrors this impulse. The empire builds not to impress foreigners, but to reassure itself. Domes rise with mathematical precision. Mosques anchor neighborhoods. Complexes feed the poor, educate the young, and bathe the weary. The city becomes a diagram of imperial order. At its center, the great mosque stands not just as a house of worship, but as a statement. God is orderly. The Sultan is his administrator. Mimar Sinan gives this vision stone. His structures are balanced, restrained, confident. Nothing strains. Nothing begs attention. They dominate skylines without shouting. The empire is announcing something important. We have arrived at equilibrium. We know who we are. This confidence extends to court culture. Suleiman's palace is wealthy but disciplined. Ceremony replaces improvisation. Roles harden. Protocol thickens. The Sultan appears less frequently, but more deliberately. Distance becomes part of authority. Power is now something to be approached cautiously, through corridors and permissions. And this is where the quiet rot begins. Because systems perfected against yesterday's problems rarely survive tomorrow's. Suleiman's laws assume a world where expansion continues, where revenue grows, where institutions remain uncontested. His reforms do not imagine stagnation. They do not plan for competition from states that innovate faster. They do not account for a military that might resist reform rather than demand it. The Janissaries, now fully entrenched, benefit enormously from stability. Their privileges are protected, their pay guaranteed, their influence secure. The Dev Shirmi slowly loses its original cruelty and its original effectiveness. Sons follow fathers. Barracks become communities. A force designed to be isolated becomes social. Loyalty remains, but it is no longer exclusive. The army that once existed to serve the state begins to see itself as the state's guardian. Succession politics grow poisonous. Mehmed's law of fratricide remains on the books, but its application becomes uneven. Princes are spared only to be imprisoned. They grow up without experience, without trust, without exposure to consequence. The palace becomes a greenhouse for paranoia. Survival instincts sharpen inward. Talent is no longer the primary filter. Caution is. Suleiman himself accelerates this with a decision that feels personal and becomes structural. His devotion to Hurrem breaks precedent. Marriage replaces rotation. The harem stops being a background institution and becomes a political arena. Access becomes currency. Whispers gain leverage. The execution of Ibrahim Pasha removes a stabilizing force. The murder of Prince Mustafa removes the most competent successor. These are not aberrations, they are symptoms. The empire's rules now allow fear to outrank ability. None of this appears catastrophic at the time. That is the danger. The empire is too strong to feel its own rigidity. Victories continue. Wealth flows. The courts function. Officials obey. But flexibility has been traded for polish. Adaptation has been replaced with preservation. The empire is no longer experimenting. It is maintaining. Suleiman dies on campaign, as emperors are supposed to. He leaves behind a state that is admired, feared, and emulated. He also leaves behind a system that assumes the world will remain recognizable. It will not. The quiet rot does not announce itself with defeat. It announces itself with comfort, with procedures that cannot be challenged without breaking everything, with institutions that interpret reform as betrayal, with elites who mistake longevity for wisdom. This is the paradox of Suleiman's reign. He perfects the empire so thoroughly that it forgets how it was built. Violence has been domesticated. Law has been standardized. Splendor has been normalized. And in doing so, the Ottomans unknowingly trade resilience for elegance. History will look back and call this the height of civilization. It will marvel at domes and codes and victories. It will rarely notice that from this point forward, every major change will be reactive. Every reform will arrive late. Every adaptation will feel like an emergency. The empire has reached its most beautiful shape. It has also reached the shape least willing to bend. And when the world begins to change faster than marble can adjust, beauty becomes inertia. Power hates empty rooms. When a throne grows distant, something else moves in to occupy the silence. Under Suleiman, authority had become ceremonial, procedural, buffered by law and ritual. After him, it becomes acoustic. Power travels by whispers, not proclamations. Decisions are no longer argued in open council. They are murmured behind screens, passed through corridors, filtered by proximity rather than merit. The empire does not collapse. It turns inward and begins to cannibalize its own bloodline. Succession, once brutal but decisive, becomes cautious and poisonous. Fratricide solved one problem by creating another. Princes who survive childhood now do so by being hidden, locked away, removed from experience in the name of stability. The palace becomes a laboratory where rulers are grown without friction, without failure, without context. When they finally emerge, often decades later, they are fragile, suspicious, and easily influenced. The state has traded violent clarity for chronic manipulation. The harem, long treated as an ornamental institution, evolves into the most consequential political space in the empire. This is not a scandal. It is structural necessity. When sultans retreat from the battlefield and from daily governance, access becomes everything. And access belongs to those who share walls with the sovereign: mothers, wives, concubines, eunuchs, the people who see the ruler unguarded, unarmored, and afraid. Hurrem's precedent now blooms unchecked. Her transformation from slave to legal wife cracked the architecture of power. It proved that intimacy could outrank protocol. that affection could bend policy. After her, the palace understands a dangerous truth. You do not need to rule the empire if you can rule the man who rules it. Influence becomes a domestic skill. The empire enters what later historians will mislabel as decline, driven by incompetence or female meddling. This misses the point. Power has not vanished, it has relocated. The game continues, but the board shrinks. The weapons change. Where armies once decided succession, now rumors do. Where battlefields once determined legitimacy, now bedtime conversations do. Princes become liabilities. Their existence threatens stability. Their popularity terrifies incumbents. Capable heirs are the most dangerous of all. The execution of Mustafa was not an anomaly. It was a preview. From now on, talent becomes a risk factor. Survival favors the unremarkable. Charisma invites suspicion. The empire quietly selects for mediocrity. This selection process is ruthless and efficient. Princes raised in isolation develop habits of caution rather than command. They trust few, delegate poorly, and cling to ritual as armor. When they rule, they do so defensively. Policy becomes reactive. Innovation looks like rebellion. Reform feels personal. Around them, factions harden. Janissaries, now entrenched and politicized, learn to read palace currents. They become kingmakers, aligning with mothers or ministers who promise protection of their privileges. Bureaucrats, trained to preserve order, side with whoever offers continuity. The sultan remains sacred, but no longer sovereign in practice. The valide sultan emerges as the axis of this system. As the mother of the ruler, she possesses legitimacy that cannot be questioned without sacrilege. She controls access, appointments, and often finances. Her alliances determine policy. Her rivalries destabilize ministries. The empire does not resent this arrangement. It adapts to it. The machine still runs. Taxes are collected. Borders are defended. Only the source of decision has shifted. This adaptability is both strength and curse. The Ottomans survive because their institutions are robust enough to function without competent rulers. They also stagnate because those same institutions have learned to operate without leadership. Initiative drains away. Risk is outsourced to procedure. The empire becomes administratively immortal and strategically timid. Bloodlines suffer accordingly. Dynastic continuity is preserved biologically but hollowed psychologically. Rulers inherit crowns without confidence. They govern through proxies and punish through paranoia. Each reign begins with purges not to secure power, but to manage fear. The palace becomes a closed ecosystem where suspicion recycles endlessly. Europe watches and misreads the situation. Diplomats report weak sultans and corrupt courts. They assume collapse is imminent. It is not. The empire's resilience frustrates them. Every prediction of imminent disintegration fails. The Ottomans bend inward but do not break. Their survival becomes embarrassing. They continue to exist when theory says they should not. Yet the cost accumulates quietly. Military innovation slows. Provincial autonomy grows. Corruption becomes systemic rather than episodic. The Janissaries resist modernization because their relevance now depends on stasis. Reform threatens identity. The empire's enemies begin to change faster than it does. Inside the palace, whispers grow louder. Marriages become treaties. Births become political events. Deaths are opportunities. The dynasty consumes itself with astonishing efficiency, preserving form while eroding function. The throne still exists. The crown still gleams. But authority has fractured into competing domestic coalitions that care more about survival than direction. This is not the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It is something more subtle and more dangerous. It is the moment when the state learns how to continue without excellence, when stability becomes an end in itself, when avoiding catastrophe replaces ambition. The empire stops asking where it is going and focuses entirely on staying where it is. Bloodlines break not because they end, but because they endure under conditions that strip them of vitality. The House of Osman does not die here, it calcifies. And calcified power can last a very long time, impressive and inert, waiting for an external shock large enough to remind it that survival is not the same as supremacy. Power rarely disappears when men vacate it. It looks for warmer hands. When the sultans retreat behind ceremony and caution, the empire does not pause. It reroutes. Authority slips through corridors too narrow for councils and settles where access is constant and oversight minimal. The Ottoman state enters its most misunderstood phase, not because women suddenly become ambitious, but because the structure finally admits what it has been practicing quietly for decades. Sovereignty follows proximity. The Valide Sultan does not seize power. Power arrives at her door and waits politely. She is the one constant in a system designed to rotate men rapidly and eliminate rivals brutally. Ministers rise and fall. Favorites vanish overnight. Janissaries riot and are appeased. The mother remains. She has known the ruler since infancy. She understands his fears before he can articulate them. In a palace engineered to produce insecure monarchs, she is the only stable reference point. This is not sentimentality. It is governance physics. When a sultan ascends after years of confinement, he is ill-prepared to rule a continent. He distrusts strangers. He clings to familiarity. The mother becomes interpreter, shield, and gatekeeper. Appointments pass through her approval. Petitions linger unless she nods. Access is monetized. Influence acquires a domestic accent. Nurbanu Sultan refines the role into something approaching executive management. With a distracted husband and a pliable son, she coordinates foreign policy, favors Venice, manages ministers, and communicates with European courts as an equal. This is not backroom chaos. It is coherent strategy executed from behind a curtain. The empire does not suffer because of her involvement. It functions because of it. Safiya Sultan follows, more openly transactional, less discreet. She turns access into an industry. Diplomatic correspondence becomes personal. Gifts flow. Bribes normalize. European ambassadors learn quickly that policy is not debated in council chambers. It is negotiated through intimacy. The palace becomes a marketplace where influence is priced, not argued. The harem transforms from residence to institution. Eunuchs operate as brokers. Alliances form across silk corridors. Intelligence circulates faster here than in the divan. Decisions made in whispers often precede formal decrees by weeks. The empire's official face lags behind its private nervous system. Critics later call this decadence. They are wrong. Decadence implies excess without purpose. This system has purpose. It solves a problem the Ottomans created themselves. When rulers are deliberately weakened to prevent civil war, something must compensate. The Valide Sultan becomes that compensatory organ. She absorbs responsibility without formal authority. She stabilizes reigns that would otherwise collapse under their own fragility. Kusem Sultan pushes this logic to its extreme. Her career spans reigns like a shadow monarchy: wife, mother, regent, grandmother. She governs openly when necessary and invisibly when convenient. She sits behind screens at council meetings, her voice filtering through layers of protocol. Ministers rise because she approves them, fall because she withdraws protection. The empire adjusts. It always does. For nearly 3 decades, the Ottomans are ruled not by a man on a throne, but by a woman managing succession like inventory. Child sultans, unstable sultans, disposable sultans. The dynasty survives because someone is counting. Yet concentration of power without transparency corrodes trust. Kosem's dominance creates rivals who cannot outmaneuver her politically, so they target her physically. Turhan Hatice Sultan, younger, ambitious, and unwilling to wait her turn, understands the system perfectly. She does not challenge policy. She challenges survival. The night Kosum is strangled is not a coup. It is a software update. Power changes hands without changing shape. The Sultanate of Women ends not because the system fails, but because it succeeds too well for too long. Centralization invites violence. It always does. After Kosum's death, the empire exhales. Authority shifts again, this time toward grand viziers, with enough autonomy to manage a distracted court. The women do not disappear. They retreat. Influence becomes subtler, less visible, more survivable. The damage, however, is cumulative. The Sultan's personal authority has been permanently diluted. Everyone knows it. Janissaries understand they can dictate terms. Ministers understand continuity matters more than vision. Provinces test limits. Reform stalls not because no one sees the need, but because no one can impose the cost. And still, the empire refuses to die. This is the central irony of the era. The Ottomans endure not despite the relocation of power, but because of it. Their institutions are elastic enough to survive weak rulers. Their bureaucracy is competent enough to compensate for palace intrigue. The machine runs on habit when leadership fails. That habit becomes a liability later. For now, it is insurance. Europe watches with fascination and contempt. Pamphlets circulate mocking eunuchs and concubines. Diplomats underestimate the state's resilience. They keep predicting collapse and keep being wrong. The Ottomans outlive forecasts through administrative muscle memory. But endurance is not momentum. While the empire manages itself, the world outside accelerates. Military technology evolves. Fiscal systems modernize. Ideologies sharpen. The Ottomans respond late, cautiously, reluctantly. Every change threatens the delicate balance that keeps the palace quiet. The legacy of this era is not feminine rule. It is depersonalized sovereignty. Power becomes something that floats between institutions, unanchored to charisma. That makes the empire survivable. It also makes it slow. When women ran the empire, they did not weaken it. They exposed its design limits. A state built to depend on a single hereditary ruler had learned how to function without one. That adaptation saves it in the short term and condemns it in the long run. Because when a crisis finally arrives that requires decisive vision rather than careful maintenance, there will be no one left accustomed to taking risks. Only experts in survival. And survival, when mistaken for strategy, is how empires linger long past their moment, impressive, intact, and already obsolete. Defeat only becomes fatal when it repeats. The Ottomans had lost battles before and treated them as inconveniences. A fortress here, a province there. Loss was temporary, as long as expansion resumed somewhere else. But permanence changes the meaning of failure. When borders stop moving forward, every retreat becomes a precedent. And precedent, once established, invites imitation. The Second Siege of Vienna is the moment this realization arrives, late and uninvited. In 1683, the empire marches not as a hungry frontier predator, but as a mature power convinced of its own inevitability. The confidence is ceremonial. Logistics are overstretched. Command is fragmented. Europe is no longer feudal chaos. It has learned coordination. The Ottomans discover this not through theory, but through encirclement. Relief armies arrive on schedule. Coalitions function. The city holds. The Ottoman army withdraws not defeated in spirit, but exposed. What follows is worse than a single loss. It is comprehension. Europe does not simply repel the Ottomans. It counterattacks with persistence. The Great Turkish War drags on for years, grinding down the myth that time favors Istanbul. The empire fights bravely, competently, and increasingly irrelevantly. Battles are lost, not because soldiers lack courage, but because systems lag. Artillery improves elsewhere, drill intensifies, financing becomes scientific. The Ottomans still fight wars like events. Europe now fights them like industries. The Treaty of Karlowitz formalizes this humiliation. For the first time, the empire signs away large territories by agreement rather than necessity. Hungary is lost. Borders retract decisively. Diplomacy now confirms what battlefields have already implied. The Ottomans are no longer negotiating from strength. They are managing decline through paperwork. This shift poisons the political atmosphere. The court searches for scapegoats. Commanders are blamed. Viziers fall. Janissaries riot when pay lags. Reform is discussed, then postponed. Every solution threatens someone powerful, and powerful men rarely consent to their own obsolescence. Meanwhile, the map grows hostile. To the north, Austria reorganizes its army into a professional force capable of sustained campaigns. To the east, Russia transforms itself with terrifying speed. Peter the Great does not merely modernize his state, he weaponizes it. Russia adopts Western methods with missionary zeal and orthodox justification. It presents itself as Byzantium's heir and Islam's nemesis. The Black Sea becomes contested space. The Straits become obsession. The Ottomans are now surrounded by enemies who learn faster than they do. Every war becomes more expensive. Every defeat more educational for opponents. The Janissaries, once the empire's edge, become its anchor. They resist retraining. They refuse new tactics. Their identity is bound to tradition. Reform is interpreted as insult. Sultans discover that the army they depend on has acquired veto power. Defeat seeps inward. Provinces test autonomy. Tax collection phrase. Corruption spreads from palace whispers to provincial contracts. Officials treat posts as investments rather than duties. The empire still functions, but increasingly for itself rather than its ruler. Survival becomes decentralized. Loyalty becomes conditional. Europe begins to name the condition, the sick man of Europe. The phrase is not medical, it is political. It assumes inevitability. It invites intervention. Once an empire is perceived as terminal, its neighbors stop respecting its borders and start planning its inheritance. The Ottomans understand this immediately. They also understand they cannot die quickly without inviting partition. So they adapt in a new way. They refuse to collapse. The empire begins to master diplomatic paralysis. It plays rivals against each other. Britain fears Russia more than it hates Ottoman stagnation. France seeks influence rather than annexation. Austria prefers buffers to chaos. The Ottomans survive by becoming inconvenient to kill. Every crisis is internationalized. Every reform is delayed just enough to avoid rebellion. Every war is concluded before catastrophe becomes final. This strategy works remarkably well, for decades, for generations. But it has a cost. Reform becomes reactive. Changes are implemented only after disaster. Military modernization arrives after defeat. Administrative overhaul follows bankruptcy. Education expands to fix yesterday's shortages. The empire is always catching up to a present that has already moved on. Internally, morale adjusts downward. Grandeur gives way to defensiveness. Where earlier sultans imagined expansion, later ones imagined preservation. Ambition narrows. Risk aversion becomes doctrine. The state stops asking how to win and focuses on how not to lose too badly. Janissaries now riot to protect stagnation. Bureaucrats manage decline efficiently. Mothers and ministers balance factions. The empire develops an advanced skill set for endurance without renewal. It becomes excellent at surviving wrong conditions. Defeat becomes permanent, not because the Ottomans stop fighting, but because fighting no longer changes the trajectory. Victories are local. Losses are structural. The empire can still punish rebellion and repel invasion, but it cannot impose long-term direction. Its wars defend the present. They never purchase the future. The psychological shift is profound. Once, defeat inspired reform through confidence. Now it inspires reform through fear. Fear produces compromise. Compromise produces half measures. Half measures satisfy no one and antagonize everyone. Europe notices the pattern. It probes. It pressures. It lends money with strings attached. It intervenes diplomatically, then militarily. Each intervention is justified as stabilization. Each stabilization erodes sovereignty. The Ottomans sign agreements they resent and cannot refuse. Paper replaces conquest as the instrument of dismemberment. And still, the empire stands. This endurance becomes its most impressive and most deceptive quality. Outsiders mistake survival for health. Insiders mistake continuity for legitimacy. Both are wrong. The Ottomans have mastered the art of delayed consequence. They are no longer winning history. They are postponing its verdict. Defeat becomes permanent when an empire internalizes loss as a baseline condition, when retreat is normalized, when the future is negotiated defensively. The Ottomans reach this phase slowly, reluctantly, and brilliantly. They do not collapse under pressure. They compress. The state shrinks its ambitions without shrinking its rituals. It preserves hierarchy while abandoning dominance. It remains imposing, ceremonial, and structurally intact. And in doing so, it ensures that when the final crisis arrives, the empire will still be standing long enough to watch it unfold. That is the cruelty of permanence. Temporary failure motivates change. Permanent defeat rewards survival instincts instead. And survival instincts, while powerful, rarely build anything new. The Ottomans will live another 2 centuries in this condition, not dying, not thriving, existing as a problem no one wants to solve decisively, a relic that refuses to disintegrate, a patient who learns how to function while sick. Defeat has become the background noise of governance, and history, patient as ever, waits for the moment when endurance finally runs out of strategies. Reform begins when illusion finally fails. Not the illusion of greatness, which can survive centuries, but the illusion of choice. By the late 18th century, the Ottomans no longer debate whether to change. They debate whether change will arrive early enough to matter. The state has crossed a psychological threshold. Tradition is no longer sacred. It is suspect. The problem is not ignorance, it is timing. Europe has transformed warfare into engineering. Armies march on schedules, not enthusiasm. Cannons are standardized. Officers are trained in mathematics rather than lineage. War is now a science, and the Ottomans are still practicing an art form perfected for a different audience. The Janissaries, once the empire's sharpest instrument, have become its loudest obstruction. They fight reform not because it threatens Islam, but because it threatens relevance. Their power depends on the world staying familiar. Selim III understands this. He is cultured, multilingual, observant. He reads reports from Europe not as curiosities, but as warnings. He does something no Ottoman ruler has done openly before. He admits the enemy is better organized. His response is surgical. Create a new army, not a reformed Janissary corps, a replacement. The Nizam-e-Sadid is everything the Janissaries are not. Uniformed, disciplined, paid reliably, trained by European methods, loyal to the throne rather than the street. It is not large, but it is symbolic. It announces a future the old guard cannot inhabit. Selim does not intend to abolish tradition immediately. He intends to outgrow it. The reaction is swift and violent. Janissaries riot. Religious conservatives frame reform as betrayal. Bureaucrats hedge. No one wants to be on the wrong side of history, but no one agrees which side that is. Selim hesitates. Compromise creeps in. The reform army survives, but it does not dominate. The old order feels cornered, not defeated. In 1807, the Janissaries act preemptively. They overthrow Salem, dismantle the new army, and restore a familiar incompetence. Selim is later murdered quietly, a martyr without followers. The lesson is brutal and precise. Reform cannot coexist with the Janissaries. One must die. Mahmud II absorbs this lesson completely. Where Salem was idealistic, Mahmud is patient. He smiles at tradition while preparing its execution. For years, he pretends compliance. He wears old clothes. He praises old rituals. He allows the Janissaries to believe they have won. All the while, he builds a modern force in the background: loyal artillery, trained officers, centralized command. When the moment arrives in 1826, it is engineered. Mahmud announces a new military initiative. The Janissaries riot exactly as predicted. This time, the Sultan does not negotiate. He declares them traitors. He unfurls the sacred banner. He invites the population to choose between reform and chaos. Then he orders artillery fire on the Janissary barracks. The massacre is efficient. Barracks collapse. Survivors are hunted. The core is dissolved. Its name is erased. 5 centuries of institutional inertia end in a single, carefully planned day. The event is labeled the auspicious incident. History often does that. It gives tidy names to irreversible acts. With the Janissaries gone, reform accelerates violently. Mahmud abolishes old offices. He centralizes ministries. He creates a modern conscript army. He builds schools to train officers, doctors, engineers. He introduces new dress codes, new hierarchies, new expectations. The empire begins to resemble the states it fears. This is not imitation. It is desperation with structure. The Tanzimat reforms follow, codifying equality before the law, reorganizing taxation, standardizing administration. On paper, the empire becomes modern. In practice, it becomes contested. Muslims resent equal status for Christians. Local elites resist central oversight. Foreign powers exploit reforms to demand more concessions. Every improvement opens a new vulnerability. The greatest irony of reform is educational. To modernize, the state creates schools. To staff them, it recruits young men. To train them, it exposes them to European ideas. These men learn languages. They read philosophy. They encounter concepts that cannot be unlearned. Constitution, representation, nation. The empire intended to build better servants. It accidentally builds critics. The young Ottomans emerge first. They argue for constitutional monarchy. They want to save the empire by limiting the Sultan. Their ideas are tolerated, then suppressed. Later, the young Turks appear, less poetic, more disciplined, trained in military academies, organized in cells. They do not ask permission. They plan. Sultans oscillate between concession and repression. Abdul Hamid II perfects this duality. He suspends the constitution, rules as an autocrat, and builds railways. He censors speech and expands education. He spies on everyone and modernizes infrastructure. His reign is a masterclass in contradictory survival. But even Abdul Hamid cannot escape the logic of his own policies. The officers he educates overthrow him. The schools he builds incubate nationalism. The army he modernizes becomes politically conscious. Reform produces the tools of revolution faster than the throne can control them. By the early 20th century, the choice has narrowed. Reform or extinction is no longer a metaphor. It is a schedule. The empire enters the First World War not out of confidence, but calculation. Alignment with Germany offers escape from debt and diplomatic isolation. It delivers catastrophe instead. War exposes every unresolved flaw. Logistics fail. Ethnic tensions explode. The Armenian genocide, stains the regime irrevocably. Gallipoli offers a moment of redemption, but moments do not reverse collapse. By 1918, the empire is militarily exhausted and politically hollow. Reform has succeeded too late and failed too early. The state is modern enough to fight an industrial war and too divided to survive its outcome. Nationalism, once imported as an administrative tool, now dismembers the empire with legal arguments and rifles. The final reform is abolition. Mustafa Kemal understands what the dynasty cannot accept. The empire cannot be saved because the empire is the problem. Reform has taught the population how to imagine sovereignty without a sultan. Once imagined, that idea cannot be erased. The dynasty's last achievement is educating its replacement. Reform or extinction was never a real choice. Reform delayed extinction by creating the conditions that made extinction necessary. The Ottomans did not fail to modernize. They modernized a structure that could not survive modernity. History rarely rewards late learners. It records their effort and moves on. The Ottomans ran out of time, not because they resisted change, but because they attempted it after the world had already decided what came next. Reform saved the state temporarily. It destroyed the empire permanently. And in that paradox, the dynasty of Osman fulfills its final role, not as conquerors or administrators, but as the reluctant midwives of a nation that required their disappearance to exist. Empires usually end loudly. This one ends by outliving its purpose. By the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire has become a contradiction walking on paper legs. It is defeated but intact, occupied but sovereign, obsolete yet stubbornly present. Diplomats plan its funeral while still requesting its signatures. Soldiers salute a flag whose authority has already migrated elsewhere. The empire refuses to die not through strength, but through procedural inertia. The First World War does not kill the Ottomans immediately. It bleeds them, campaign by campaign. Front by front, the empire is stretched beyond relevance. In the Caucasus, armies freeze. In Mesopotamia, supply lines unravel. In Arabia, revolt fractures loyalty. Only at Gallipoli does the old instinct briefly return. Defensive brilliance, improvised heroism. A young officer named Mustafa Kemal emerges from the chaos, not as a loyal servant of empire, but as a man learning exactly where its limits lie. When the armistice arrives in 1918, the empire still exists on maps but not in practice. Allied warships anchor in the Bosphorus. Constantinople is occupied without a siege, without a cannon fired in anger. The city that once defied the world opens its gates quietly. This humiliation is not theatrical, it is administrative. Orders arrive from foreign officers. The Sultan signs what he is told. The caliphate remains. Authority does not. The Treaty of Sèvres is not negotiation. It is dissection. Borders are redrawn by outsiders. Protectorates are assigned. Straits are internationalized. Armenia and Greece are promised territory carved from Anatolia itself. The Ottoman state is reduced to a symbolic shell. The dynasty still exists only because it is useful as a signature. Mehmed VI understands the truth instinctively. Resistance from the palace would invite annihilation. Cooperation offers survival. He chooses survival. History will not forgive him for it. History rarely forgives rulers who mistake endurance for leadership, but the empire has taught an entire generation something dangerous. That sovereignty can exist without sultans. That authority can relocate. That obedience is conditional. While Constantinople submits, Anatolia refuses. In the interior, officers trained by the empire now reject it. Mustafa Kemal does not revolt in the name of reform. He revolts in the name of legitimacy. The Sultan, he declares, is no longer free. His signatures are invalid. The nation must speak for itself. This is the final irony. The Ottoman state created the man who will bury it. Modern military schools, centralized command, secular discipline, national consciousness. Kemal is not a foreign infection. He is a perfected Ottoman officer who has reached a logical conclusion the dynasty cannot accept. The War of Independence is brutal and unromantic. Greeks advance, Armenians fight, French forces probe. Istanbul condemns the resistance and issues religious decrees against it. The Caliph calls the nationalists rebels. The nation ignores him. Legitimacy has moved again, this time permanently. Victory comes not through imperial revival, but through imperial abandonment. When Greek forces collapse and withdraw, the Allies renegotiate. The Treaty of Lausanne replaces Sèvres. The world recognizes a new political reality. Turkey exists. The empire does not. The end arrives without ceremony. No execution, no storming of palaces. A vote abolishes the Sultanate. Mehmed VI leaves quietly aboard a foreign ship. 6 centuries end in exile. The Caliphate lingers briefly, then follows. The Ottoman Empire dies not because it is conquered, but because it is no longer useful even to itself. The Republic of Turkey rises not as continuation, but as rejection. It strips away religion from governance, dynastic legitimacy from power, empire from identity. The past is treated as weight to be discarded. History is rewritten as necessity rather than destiny. The empire's memory becomes something to manage carefully. And yet the Ottomans succeed in one final, unintended way. They do not vanish. Their institutions shape the republic that replaces them. Their borders constrain it. Their population remembers them selectively. Their failures become lessons. Their survival instincts become national habits. The empire that refused to die ultimately forces history to kill it politely. No final battle, no cathartic collapse, just irrelevance formalized. This is perhaps the most unsettling ending possible. The House of Osman does not fall. It expires. What remains is not nostalgia, but pattern. A frontier state grows through violence and adaptability. It peaks through law and spectacle. It stagnates through rigidity. It survives through compromise. It modernizes too late. It educates its successors. And finally, it steps aside because the world has changed faster than dynasties can. The Ottomans ruled for over 600 years, not because they were uniquely wise, but because they were uniquely flexible. They borrowed ruthlessly. They adapted shamelessly. They governed pragmatically. Their fall does not erase that achievement. It contextualizes it. Empires do not die when they are weak. They die when their organizing logic no longer explains the world around them. By the 20th century, empire itself has become the wrong answer. The Ottomans sense this dimly, resist it briefly, and then embody it one last time by dissolving themselves through law rather than violence. The tree from Osman's dream does not burn. It withers. Its branches become nations. Its roots remain underground, shaping soil long after the trunk is gone. History, unimpressed as ever, records the cycle without sentiment. The empire that refused to die finally accepts the verdict it postponed for 200 years, not with collapse, but with replacement. And in that quiet ending lies its most modern act of all.